same time.
This is a great exhibit. This is definitely, I really think this is fascinating. Take care.
Well, the mission of the Jewish Historical Society is to preserve and interpret the Jewish presence in Washington during the last century and a half. The building was built in 1876. It was the home, the religious home, of the Addis Israel congregation until 1907. In 1969, when this building was about to be demolished, many members of the society banded together with other interested people in the community to save it and to have it moved 3 blocks to 3rd and G Streets Northwest on a tiny plot of land that had been dedicated alongside the freeway by the District of Columbia government. The exhibit on Louis D. Brandeis, American Zionist, is one of the exhibits that we think exemplifies the mission of this Jewish Historical Society.
The first time we met was in the 60s, and here we are in the 90s.
We were very fortunate to be able to get the services of Dr. Melvin Urofsky, who is an outstanding historian and has specialized in the history of the legal community, and particularly Justice Brandeis.
Well, one of the things that's always interested me and other scholars is why someone like Brandeis became a Zionist. He grew up in an assimilated German Jewish family. There was very little in his parents' background. There was very little even in his early career that brought him into large contact with the massive Jews. So it really is not until he was in his 40s, maybe even into his 50s, before he really had major contact with Jews. And the one sort of latent influence that was there was his uncle, who was his role, what we would now call role model. His uncle had been a lawyer and who turns out to have been a Zionist. And then he meets a man named Jacob de Haas, who says, your uncle was a noble Zionist, and Brandeis' ears literally perk up and says, tell me more. He began to read on it in 1913. He joins the movement, 1912, 1913. He really becomes quite influential when World War I breaks out, and he's asked to head the Provisional Executive Committee. Brandeis brought into the movement a number of American Jews who up until this point had really not been involved too much in the movement. What they had in common was that they were all involved in progressive reform, as was Brandeis. In fact, Brandeis knew people like Julian Mack and Stephen Wise, not from Jewish activities, but from their reform activities. In the long run, what was more important was he brought a certain philosophy to the movement. The leaders of the American Jewish Committee, which at that time was the dominant organizational entity in American Jewry, were the lawyer, Lewis Marshall, and the financier, Jacob Schiff. Marshall was a very strong-willed figure. The joke used to be that the American Jewish Committee ran on martial law. And both he and Schiff had very strong antipathies towards Zionism because they believed that American Jews had achieved the status they had in the United States by foregoing the yearning to return to Palestine. And what Brandeis did was to marry Zionism to American ideals. And his famous saying was, to be a good American, we must be a good Jew, and to be a good Jew, we must be a Zionist. In World War I, Turkey was on the side of Germany, and Turkey had owned Palestine at that time. When it became clear that Turkey would lose Palestine, Great Britain, in an effort to gain the support of worldwide Jewry, issued the Balfour Declaration, which promised a home for the Jews in Palestine after the war. Then the question arose, what kind of Jewish state would it be? Here was a chance to take what had up till now been a dream and turn it into reality. There were parades through the city and everything. And the Pittsburgh program is the only statement we really have by American Zionism as to what kind of Jewish state American Zionists envisioned. There was a lot of pressure on Brandeis to go visit Palestine at the end of the war, and was very, very sensitive to the idea of what the proper restraints were upon a member of the Supreme Court. But finally, he does go, and he falls in love with the country. The letters he writes back to his wife are just ecstatic. I now understand why Jews have loved the country for this. And of course, the settlers in Palestine, knowing all Brandeis had done, went out of their way to give him a royal welcome there. At the Paris Peace Conference, the British, with the Balfour Declaration in hand, are now seeking to get the mandate over Palestine. And Felix Frankfurter goes to meet with Prince Faisal, who is considered the leader of the Arabs at Paris. And they reach an agreement where Faisal issues this letter that the Arabs would welcome the return of their cousins, the Jews, to the Holy Land and foresees a chance for them to cooperate. The Big Four do, in fact, ultimately give the mandate over Palestine to Great Britain at the San Remo Conference. There were deep divisions developing within the world Zionist movements, both at the ideological and at the practical level, and also political. Weizmann didn't like the idea of the Supreme Court justice who, if he had wanted to, could have ousted him from leadership of the world movement. So Weizmann comes over here in 1921. There is a showdown at the Cleveland Convention that year, and the supporters of Weizmann outnumber the supporters of Brandeis. Brandeis is unwilling to remain as a leader of the movement till he resigns, along with 50 of his lieutenants, essentially. They are now going to be soldiers in the ranks. One group that remained loyal to Brandeis was Hadassah, which was very much imbued with his spirit of practical work. For the first time, clean, pasteurized milk becomes available, and of course, the distribution method was a little rudimentary. It was, donkeys went around with milk cans on their back, and women came and got fresh milk. More importantly, medical care was absolutely atrocious. And Hadassah started the type of project that Brandeis loved. It was practical, it was down to earth, it had immediate results. They sent over a team of doctors and nurses. And the thing that should be pointed out is that Hadassah, from the time it started, treated both Arabs and Jews. Henrietta Zold, whom Brandeis admired enormously, was resident in Palestine in charge of Hadassah's work. Brandeis gave $1,000 a year so that she would be able to continue her work in Palestine, and he gave that, as far as I know, for the rest of his life. In the late 1920s, with the American Depression, there was a call for Brandeis to return to leadership of the Zionist movement. Well, at this point, he is already 75 years old. He feels he can't do it. But he does have a younger generation coming on, Zip and Robert Zold. And they and others of that generation become the next generation of Brandeisians to lead the Zionist movement, and they will lead the movement right on through the 1950s. During the 1930s, Arab attacks on Jewish villages increased at the same time that the British were attempting to reduce their role in Palestine, and the result was that Jews felt they had to take their defense into their own hands, which they did through a group known as the Haganah, which was the Jewish Defense Force. Brandeis was very much in favor of this, and he also was quite taken with the up-and-coming leader of the Yishuv, which was the Jewish settlement in Palestine, David Ben-Gurion, who would later be Israel's first prime minister. He decides to support Ben-Gurion, and he is one of the chief contributors to a secret fund that allows Ben-Gurion to buy arms during the 1930s for the Haganah for self-defense. There were actually two major challenges to American Zionism in the 1930s, one of which was taking place in Palestine, the other was the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi movement in Germany. Brandeis died in October of 1941 before news of the final solution reached the United States, and also before the State of Israel was founded. But I think that a man who said, "I have great confidence in time," knew that his vision was well on its way to being implemented, especially in the kibbutz at Ein HaShofet. It was a typical kibbutz, in some ways stockade and tower, but one thing I think would have pleased Brandeis enormously is that Ein HaShofet has pretty much stuck to the type of cooperative, egalitarian philosophy that marks so much of Brandeis's life. It is now a prosperous kibbutz, but still small, and still one in which the ideals that it was originally founded for continue to govern. Alice, there's an awful lot that's been mentioned about the justice and his views on property. He wouldn't own an automobile, for example, and he had very Spartan tastes. Did he ever discuss his views on property, or what do you recall about that?
The reason he didn't have possessions was that he felt that property owned you. You did not own property, and therefore he never wanted to own a car. He in fact rented the house he had in Chatham for many years, and I think only finally bought it because he was afraid they were going to sell it. He wanted to be free. That's why he felt so strongly about not having a lot of things, is that they cluttered up your life. You would spend all your time taking care of them if you had too many things.
In my year, which was 37 to 38 term, the justice had settled into remaining in his apartment, doing his work there, and I had just heard from someone that when the Supreme Court opened, the justice was taken, each justice was shown his chambers, and Justice Brandeis looked at his chambers and said, "Very nice," and never went in it again. I just thought he didn't need this great large room and all the space that had been assigned to a justice. He'd been doing very well for many years the way he was, and he wanted to stay that way.
My memories include not only what you would imagine, telling him about schoolwork and talking about Roman and Greek history and American history, which were special interests of his and mine, but also a very vivid memory I have of discussing facts in the past and being with grandfather, and if you came to a point where you were uncertain about a fact or he was uncertain about a fact, everything stopped and we went, or I went, to a nearby bookcase to consult an encyclopedia or some other book while grandfather patiently waited for me to come back with an answer. So I think it was a relationship in which he drew out his grandchildren.
You were supposed to report on what you were doing, and he asked questions. The business of going and looking something up, that wasn't just applied to the children. If you were having dinner there on a Sunday and an issue came up that somebody didn't know the answer to, you would go look it up either in the dictionary or in the encyclopedia till everybody had brought together as much knowledge as they had.
Mrs. Brandeis ran the household, and of course the teas every Sunday afternoon. I participated. I helped with all the teas. That was main part of the law clerk's job, actually, on the weekend, was to be sure that you were there to give Miss Brandeis a hand and to help move people around, because if two people were talking to each other for quite a long time, she would feel that they'd talked long enough, they ought to circulate and meet more people, so I would go over and break it up.
One thing from the 1930s, which I learned about afterwards, but is very much related to the idea of what these discussions were like on California Street, are the group of young Americans who established the kibbutz Ein HaShofet. Their memories, and these people are still active at Ein HaShofet today, although they're around the age of 80. But these people recall indeed being closely examined about all the details of how the kibbutz was operating. And that was the nature of their relationship, close following of their developments, and I think a great deal of pride. They had wanted to name the kibbutz after grandfather, and he declined, and so they came up with a compromise, which is Ein HaShofet, well of the judge.